I did this for years. I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing for my body. I exercised consistently, I watched what I ate, I stayed active, and I convinced myself that the occasional bad night of sleep or the stress that came with running a practice was just the cost of a productive life. What I did not know, what nobody told me, and what most physicians still are not telling their patients today, is that three of the habits I thought were protecting me were quietly accelerating the destruction of the very cells my body depends on to repair, regenerate, and stay functional as I age. I am talking about stem cells. Not the embryonic kind you have heard debated in the news. Your own adult stem cells, the ones living right now in your bone marrow, your muscles, your intestinal lining, your brain. The ones responsible for rebuilding damaged tissue, generating new blood cells, maintaining your immune system, and keeping the machinery of your body running decade after decade. And the research I have been reviewing over the past several years, rigorous, peer-reviewed, published in journals like Cell Stem Cell, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, and Nature Communications, paints a picture that genuinely changes how I think about everyday health decisions. Roughly 37% of people over 60 in the United States are experiencing measurable declines in stem cell function without knowing it. That decline shows up as fatigue that sleep does not fix, as a wound on your shin that takes 3 times longer to heal than it did 15 years ago, as an immune system that seems slower, less decisive, as a loss of muscle mass that no amount of protein or exercise seems to stop. These are not separate problems with separate causes. They are often the same problem viewed from different angles. An aging stem cell pool that is being depleted faster than it should be, by habits that appear from the outside to be healthy. Before I go further, and I say this because it matters, everything I am about to share is educational. It is based on published science, and it is meant to give you a framework for understanding your own biology. It is not a substitute for working with your physician. If you are on medications, if you have a cardiovascular condition, diabetes, or any autoimmune diagnosis, please bring this information to your doctor before changing anything about your routine. What I am sharing here is information. What you do with it should be a conversation with someone who knows your full medical history. If you find value in conversations like this one, subscribing helps me keep doing this kind of research and bringing it to you. But no pressure at all. Let us get into what the science actually shows. The reason I am focusing specifically on habits that seem healthy is deliberate. If I told you that smoking destroys stem cells, you would nod and move on. You already know smoking is bad. What is more useful, and honestly more alarming, is understanding that a form of exercise millions of people over 50 are doing with the specific intention of protecting their health may be doing measurable damage to their stem cell reserves. That a food in your refrigerator right now, one that carries a label saying whole grain, or natural, or high protein, is probably classified as an ultra-processed food, and 2 large national studies published in 2024 show that eating it is accelerating your biological aging at a measurable, quantifiable rate. That the fragmented sleep you have accepted as normal because you are 53 or 61 or 70, and this is just how sleep is now, is not neutral. It is actively restructuring the genetic machinery of your blood stem cells in ways that a weekend of good rest will not undo. The science here is not speculative. It is coming from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Columbia, and some of the largest population studies ever conducted on human aging. And what makes it genuinely urgent for people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s is a biological reality that younger people do not have to think about. At 50, your stem cell reserve has already declined. Not because you did anything wrong, simply because that is what biology does. Estimates suggest that by the time you reach 50, the regenerative capacity of your hematopoietic stem cells, the ones in your marrow that produce every blood and immune cell in your body, has already dropped by 30 to 40% compared to your 20s. That is the baseline. That is before any of the habits we are going to talk about enter the picture. The reason this matters is that when your reserve is already reduced, any additional stressor, any habit that accelerates stem cell depletion or dysfunction, has an exponentially larger effect than it would in a 25-year-old. You have less margin for error, which means the information in this conversation is not academic. it is practical, and it is time-sensitive. Let me start with the research, because I want you to see where these conclusions actually come from. In 2022, a team at Harvard Stem Cell Institute, Columbia University, and Massachusetts General Hospital published a study in the Journal of Experimental Medicine that I consider one of the most important and least discussed papers on aging from the last decade. What they investigated was deceptively simple. What does disrupted sleep actually do to your blood stem cells? Not your energy levels, not your mood, not your performance at work. The stem cells themselves, at the genetic level. What they found was this. Sleep disruption does not just leave your stem cells tired. It restructures their epigenome. To understand why that matters, think of your DNA as a library of instruction books. The epigenome is the system of flags and bookmarks that determines which books get opened and which stay on the shelf. Sleep disruption, chronic and accumulated, of the kind that tens of millions of adults over 50 experience as simply normal life, reprograms those flags. It changes which genetic instructions your stem cells are reading. It pushes them toward patterns of abnormal proliferation and exaggerated inflammatory response. In other words, it does not just slow your stem cells down, it changes what they do. The finding that made me stop and reread the paper 3 times was this. Recovery sleep did not fully reverse the damage. The epigenetic changes persisted. The researchers were measuring not just what happened during the disruption, but what happened after normal sleep resumed, and the stem cells did not return to baseline. The reprogramming was durable. An earlier study from 2015, published in Nature Communications by Rawls and colleagues, had already shown that sleep deprivation in donor animals reduced the ability of transplanted hematopoietic stem cells to engraft in recipients by more than 50%. The mechanism they identified involved a microRNA called miR19B. Sleep deprivation suppressed it, which in turn elevated SOX genes, which blocked the stem cells' ability to home to the bone marrow and establish themselves. What the 2022 Harvard paper added was the understanding that this was not just a temporary suppression. It was a lasting reprogramming. For someone in their 50s or 60s, this means something specific. You probably sleep less soundly than you did at 30. You probably wake up more often, fall back asleep slowly, and spend less time in the deep, slow-wave sleep that is the most restorative phase. That is almost universal in this age group, and it has been treated clinically as an annoyance, something to manage with better sleep hygiene, maybe a low-dose supplement. What this research asks us to consider is whether it is actually a stem cell crisis playing out in slow motion, night after night, across years and decades. The second body of research I want to walk you through involves chronic stress. Not the acute stress of a difficult conversation or a tight deadline, the kind that resolves within hours and in moderate doses actually stimulates healthy cellular adaptation. I am talking about the sustained, low-grade, always-on cortisol elevation that characterizes modern life for many people over 50. The kind where the source of stress is not a single event, but a permanent condition. Financial pressure, caregiving responsibilities, a career that never fully disconnects, a baseline of worry that has been running for so long you have stopped noticing it. A comprehensive review, published in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity in 2022, synthesized decades of research on the molecular pathways connecting chronic psychological stress to accelerated biological aging. The conclusion, stated plainly, is that chronic stress damages stem cells through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. First, elevated cortisol over time directly increases DNA damage in multiple cell lines, including the progenitor cells that give rise to stem cells, while simultaneously reducing the efficiency of DNA repair systems. Your cells accumulate errors faster and fix them slower. Second, chronic cortisol elevation causes mitochondrial dysfunction. Your cellular power plants start running inefficiently, producing more oxidative byproducts, more of what are called reactive oxygen species, which create further cellular damage in a self-reinforcing cycle. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, Chronic stress shortens telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps at the ends of your chromosomes, and their length is one of the most well-validated markers of biological age we have. Chronic stress reduces the activity of telomerase, the enzyme responsible for maintaining telomere length, and accelerates the rate at which telomeres shorten with each cell division. Here is what makes this particularly significant for the 50-plus population. Research on adrenal aging documented that the baseline level of cortisol is already higher in older adults, and that the sensitivity of the HPA axis, the feedback system that is supposed to shut cortisol down once a stressor passes, becomes blunted with age. In a 25-year-old, cortisol spikes during stress and returns to baseline relatively quickly. In a 60-year-old, that spike tends to be higher, lasts longer, and the reset takes more time. The practical implication is that the same stressor produces a larger, longer cortisol burden in an older body. The damage accumulates faster. The margin for chronic stress, which was never generous, narrows further with every decade. A more recent review, published in Frontiers in Aging in 2026, confirmed the specific molecular cascade we are talking about. Stress chronically activates the HPA axis, which sustains elevated glucocorticoids, which drive mitochondrial dysfunction, which increases the production of reactive oxygen species, which creates oxidative damage in the very niches where stem cells reside and are supposed to be maintained. Each step in that chain has been measured. Each link has been demonstrated in human tissue. This is not a theoretical pathway. It is a documented series of events that is, in all likelihood, occurring right now in people who carry the kind of chronic stress load that modern life encourages us to normalize. I want to come now to the finding that I think will surprise the most people in this audience. Not the sleep research, not the stress data. Something you bought at a grocery store, probably this week, while actively trying to eat well. Ultra-processed foods. I want to be precise about what I mean, because the term gets thrown around loosely and often applied only to obvious junk food, fast food, candy, chips. That framing misses the point entirely, and it may be why you have been unknowingly consuming these foods while believing you were protecting yourself. The formal classification system used by researchers, called the NOVA system, defines ultra-processed foods not by their nutrient profile, but by the degree of industrial transformation they have undergone. An ultra-processed food is one that has been fractured apart from its original whole food matrix, combined with industrial additives, emulsifiers, colorants, flavor enhancers, modified starches, texturizers, and reassembled into a product that resembles, but is not, whole food. By that definition, the following items are ultra-processed. Packaged whole grain bread, even the kind labeled 100% whole wheat. Commercial fruit yogurts, including the ones marketed as probiotic and health-forward. Brand name granola. Nearly every protein bar currently sold in the United States. Most commercial plant-based milks that contain gums, oils, or synthetic added vitamins. Breakfast cereals, including the ones marketed as low sugar and heart healthy. If you looked at your breakfast this morning and feel confident it was healthy, there is a reasonable chance that some portion of it was ultra-processed by this definition. Two studies published in 2024, both large, both rigorous, quantified what chronic consumption of these foods does to the rate of biological aging, measured not by how old you feel, but by validated biomarkers in your blood. The first came from the Molisani study in Italy, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in December 2024, with 22,495 participants. Esposito and colleagues found that high consumption of ultra-processed foods was significantly associated with accelerated biological aging as measured by circulating biomarkers in blood. Not a marginal association, a statistically robust one in a sample large enough to have substantial statistical power. The second study used NHANES data, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is as close to a nationally representative sample of American adults as research gets. Published in Age and Aging in November 2024 by Cardoso, Liu, Machado, and colleagues at Monash University and Columbia University, it found that for every 10% increase in the proportion of your daily calories coming from ultra-processed foods, The gap between your biological age and your chronological age increased by 2.4 months. Read that again slowly. 10%. If 40% of your daily calories come from ultra-processed foods, which is actually below the American average according to CDC data, you may be carrying the equivalent of roughly 10 months of additional biological aging compared to someone eating the same total calories from minimally processed whole foods. If you are at 50%, which the epidemiological data suggests is typical, the math becomes considerably more concerning. And the N. Haynes paper was careful to note that this association was partially independent of overall diet quality, suggesting that the degree of industrial processing itself, not just the macronutrient composition, is driving the aging acceleration. The mechanism is not mysterious, even if the details continue to be refined. Ultra-processed foods consistently alter the gut microbiome in ways that increase intestinal permeability, trigger low-level immune activation, and elevate the markers of systemic inflammation, specifically interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein. That state of chronic low-grade inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging in the gerontology literature, is directly hostile to stem cell function. Stem cells do not exist in isolation. They live in carefully maintained microenvironments called niches, and those niches are extremely sensitive to inflammatory signals. When the niche is chronically inflamed, stem cells shift from a state of productive maintenance to a state of stress response. They either exhaust themselves trying to compensate, or they enter senescence, a state of suspended function that we will come back to, because it is the convergence point for all four stressors we are discussing today. Now I want to address the fourth habit. This is the one I was most personally reluctant to discuss, because it runs against a message that many physicians, myself included for a long time, have been giving patients consistently for decades. Excessive cardiovascular exercise without adequate recovery is a stem cell stressor. Let me be absolutely precise here, because I am emphatically not telling you that exercise is bad for your stem cells. The evidence says precisely the opposite. A landmark study published in Cell Stem Cell in April 2023 from research teams at Stanford University and Baylor College of Medicine conducted single-cell RNA sequencing on 435,628 individual cells across multiple tissues in young and aged mice, an extraordinary level of resolution, and produced what is now the most comprehensive atlas of how exercise affects the stem cell landscape of the aging body that has ever been published. The conclusion was clear. Moderate aerobic exercise reduces inflammatory signatures in muscle stem cells, neural stem cells, and hematopoietic stem cells simultaneously, and restores intercellular communication patterns characteristic of younger organisms. Exercise, done correctly, is one of the most powerful protective interventions for stem cell function in the aging body that we know of. The problem is, what happens when exercise stops being moderate, when recovery is insufficient, when the intensity and frequency are high enough that the body never fully returns to baseline between sessions before being stressed again. In that scenario, exercise stops being a signal for adaptation and becomes a chronic stressor. Cortisol stays elevated for longer than the biology requires. Reactive oxygen species accumulate faster than the body's antioxidant systems can neutralize them. And the muscle stem cells, called satellite cells in the literature, that are supposed to be repairing the microdamage from exercise and building adaptive capacity, start to show the same signs of exhaustion seen in other chronic stress contexts. The same Cell Stem Cell paper notes explicitly that aged muscle stem cells are already more prone to cell death, senescence, and loss of myogenic potential than young ones. Overtraining in a 55 or 65-year-old is not just a performance issue. It may be accelerating the depletion of the cellular machinery that maintains muscle mass, supports recovery from injury, and sustains physical independence over the long arc of aging. The pattern I see clinically, in patients who come in frustrated that their body is not responding the way it used to, despite their discipline and consistency, is often this. They are doing too much steady state or high-intensity cardio, not enough resistance training, and not nearly enough recovery. They have confused volume with benefit, and their bodies, at a cellular level, are paying a price that does not show up on a scale or in a performance metric, but that accumulates over years in the form of accelerated muscle loss, slower recovery from illness and injury, and a body that seems to be aging faster than their lifestyle should explain. Now I want to explain the mechanism that ties all four of these stressors together. Because disrupted sleep, chronic cortisol, ultra-processed foods, and excessive exercise without recovery do not damage your stem cells through four separate, unrelated pathways. They converge, they amplify each other, and the convergence point is a process called cellular senescence. When a stem cell is chronically stressed by cortisol, by oxidative damage, by inflammatory cytokines from a disrupted gut microbiome, by the accumulated failure of nightly epigenetic maintenance, it eventually reaches a threshold where it stops dividing and enters a dormant state. This is cellular senescence. And here is the part that is rarely explained clearly. Senescent cells do not simply stop working quietly. They begin secreting a cocktail of inflammatory molecules. Researchers call this the SASP, the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. That secretory profile acts on neighboring cells, promoting their senescence as well. It is a self-amplifying loop. Stress creates senescent stem cells. Senescent stem cells create more inflammation. More inflammation stresses the remaining functional stem cells, which accelerates their senescence. A finding referenced in a comprehensive 2025 review of hematopoietic stem cell aging makes this particularly concrete. The research found that even transient inflammatory exposures, not chronic ones, but single significant inflammatory events that fully resolved, could produce lasting reductions in functional hematopoietic stem cells. A year after the inflammation was gone, the bone marrow had not fully recovered its stem cell capacity. The system does not forgive and forget easily. The choices you are making now about how you manage sleep, how you handle chronic stress, what you eat, and how hard you push in exercise are not just affecting how you feel this week. They are shaping the stem cell reserve your body will have available for the next decade and beyond. Let me take a moment to draw these four mechanisms together in a way that makes the practical picture clearer. Think of your stem cell reserve as a savings account that you were born with a certain balance in, and that your body has been slowly drawing on since birth to fund its daily repair and maintenance operations. By 50, that balance is already meaningfully lower than it was at 25. That is not a disease. That is biology. But whether that balance continues to decline at a normal rate or begins accelerating towards zero depends enormously on the environment you create for those cells day in and day out. Poor sleep is not restoring the account. It is actively restructuring it in ways that make the existing balance less functional and less reliable. Chronic stress is like a high-fee account, draining a small but constant percentage of what is there. Ultra-processed foods are contaminating the environment around the account, making every withdrawal more costly and less precise. And excessive exercise without recovery is making withdrawals that are too large too frequently, before the account has had time to replenish. Those four things together, especially in combination, create a trajectory. And the trajectory is not predetermined, it is modifiable. The research showing that fasting refeeding cycles can restore aged hematopoietic stem cells to near youthful function is important precisely because it demonstrates the plasticity that remains in this system at almost any age. The stem cells are not simply counting down. They are responding to signals, right now, and the signals you send them through your daily choices are more powerful than most people, including most physicians, have been taught to appreciate. Here is what I want you to do with this information. Before anything else, understand that I am sharing a framework, not a prescription. Some of what follows will require a conversation with your doctor, particularly if you are on medications, have specific diagnoses, or are considering supplement protocols. Everything I am about to recommend has peer-reviewed evidence behind it. None of it is conjecture, and I will tell you clearly where the evidence is stronger and where it is more preliminary. As always, if you have any significant health conditions or take any medications, please speak with your physician before implementing the changes I am about to describe. This is the standard for responsible medicine, and I am not going to set it aside for the sake of sounding authoritative. The first and highest priority intervention, if you take nothing else from this conversation, is sleep quality and consistency. Not just quantity, though quantity matters. Consistency. The Harvard Epigenomics paper is clear that the circadian system, the internal biological clock that governs stem cell maintenance, responds to regularity more than to almost any other variable. Your stem cells are expecting sleep at a predictable time. Disrupting that expectation, even on weekends, compounds over time. Pick a time to go to bed. Pick a time to wake up. Hold those times 7 days a week, including weekends, for at least 4 weeks, and then evaluate how you feel. Most people who do this report a qualitative change in morning alertness within 10 to 14 days. Not dramatic, subtle, but different. For the environmental setup, your room temperature for sleep should be in the range of 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 18 to 20 Celsius. This is the range in which deep, slow-wave sleep, the most restorative phase and the one that declines most sharply with age, is most readily accessible. Complete darkness matters more than most people realize. Melatonin production in people over 50 is already substantially lower than in younger adults. Any light exposure during the sleep window further suppresses the residual production. On caffeine, the metabolic clearance of caffeine slows significantly with age. In a 20-year-old, the biological half-life of caffeine runs roughly 4 to 5 hours. In someone over 50, it may be 8, 9, or 10 hours, depending on genetics and liver function. A coffee at 2 in the afternoon may still have meaningful physiological activity at midnight. The practical guideline I give patients is no caffeine after noon or 1 in the afternoon. Try it for 2 weeks before deciding whether it makes a difference for you specifically. If you suspect sleep apnea, which is substantially underdiagnosed in this age group, and particularly in women, address that before anything else. Fragmented sleep from undiagnosed apnea overrides every other intervention. You cannot optimize stem cell maintenance through sleep if the sleep itself is being interrupted dozens of times per hour by apnea events. The second priority is restructuring how you exercise, not necessarily reducing it. The Cell Stem Cell 2023 Atlas study is explicit about the intensity range that produces stem cell benefit. Moderate aerobic exercise, what exercise physiology is called Zone 2. The intensity at which you can hold a conversation but are breathing noticeably harder than at rest. At this intensity, the research shows you are improving mitochondrial function, reducing systemic inflammation, and stimulating the intercellular communication patterns associated with younger biology, without generating the sustained cortisol elevation and oxidative burden that come with higher intensity efforts done too frequently. The target from the evidence base is approximately 150 minutes per week of Zone 2 exercise. For most people, this means 3 to 5 sessions of 30 to 45 minutes at a brisk walking, cycling, or swimming pace. The kind where you could narrate a podcast but would not want to give a speech. The other critical component, and this is particularly important for muscle stem cell health, is resistance training. 2 to 3 sessions per week targeting all major muscle groups. Resistance training is the most potent cellular signal we know of for keeping muscle satellite cells active and functional as we age. The loss of muscle mass that most people attribute simply to getting older is, at the cellular level, significantly driven by the declining activity of muscle stem cells. Resistance training is the intervention with the strongest evidence for reversing that decline. What I am asking you to consider pulling back from is not exercise, but excessive high-intensity, steady-state cardio performed without adequate recovery. If you are training intensely 5 or 6 days a week, if your resting heart rate is trending upward over months, if you are waking up more fatigued than when you went to sleep, if your performance metrics are declining despite your effort, those are biological signals that your exercise has crossed the line from stimulus to chronic stressor. The stem cell biology at that point is not working in your favor, even if your discipline is admirable. The third priority is food, specifically auditing what you are actually eating for ultra-processed content, including and especially the foods you believe are healthy. Here is the practical test. Read the ingredient list on your bread. If it contains more than 5 or 6 ingredients, and if those ingredients include words you will not find in a home kitchen, words like modified starch, soy lecithin, datem, calcium propionate, mono and diglycerides, you are eating an ultra-processed food, regardless of what the front of the package says. The same test applies to your yogurt. Plain full-fat yogurt with live cultures and no additives is not ultra-processed. Commercial yogurt with added fruit preparations, thickeners, sweeteners, and a 7-ingredient label most certainly is. The same principle applies to granola, to protein bars, to most commercial cereals, and to nearly every packaged snack food that deploys health language on its front panel. The practical intervention here is not perfection, and it is not a wholesale dietary overhaul. What the NHANES 2024 study tells us is that every 10% shift away from ultra-processed foods and toward minimally processed whole foods matters. It matters in ways that are measurable in your blood. Start with the highest frequency items in your diet and find minimally processed replacements. Swap packaged granola for rolled oats prepared with fruit and nuts. Swap commercial fruit yogurt for plain Greek yogurt with actual berries added by you. Swap the protein bar for a small handful of mixed nuts and a piece of fruit. These sound like incremental changes. Compounded across weeks, months, and years, they are exactly the kind of shifts that the biological aging data suggests makes a meaningful, measurable difference. For the broader dietary pattern, the evidence points consistently towards several categories of food that support the cellular environment stem cells need. Leafy green vegetables, spinach, kale, arugula, consumed daily, provide folate and other cofactors essential for DNA synthesis and repair, the exact processes that stem cells rely on for their maintenance and self-renewal. Fatty fish, salmon, sardines, mackerel, 2 to 3 times per week, provides EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids that reduce the systemic inflammatory tone that we have identified as one of the primary environmental threats to stem cell niches. Legumes 4 to 5 times per week, lentils, chickpeas, black beans, supply the prebiotic fiber that feeds the gut microbiome, which in turn modulates systemic inflammatory signaling. Berries, blueberries particularly, are among the most potent dietary sources of polyphenol compounds that counter the oxidative stress we have been discussing throughout this conversation. What you are building with this pattern is not just a more favorable macronutrient ratio. You are creating a systemic inflammation level, a gut microbiome composition, a metabolic and oxidative environment in which stem cell niches can maintain their function rather than being constantly activated into defensive responses. The fourth priority, and I want to be clear that it is not less important, but rather placed fourth because it is often the hardest to act on independently of the others, is chronic stress management. Specifically, the goal of reducing sustained cortisol elevation. The intervention with the most consistent scientific evidence behind it is mindfulness meditation, practiced consistently for 10 to 20 minutes daily. I am aware that this recommendation meets resistance from some people who consider themselves too practical or too skeptical for it. What I would ask is that you set that skepticism aside temporarily and look at what the measurements actually show. Research, including work by Elizabeth Eppel and Elisa Eppel at UCSF, has measured the effect of sustained meditation practice on cortisol levels and on telomerase activity, the enzyme that protects and maintains telomere length. Regular meditators show measurably reduced cortisol and measurably increased telomerase activity compared to non-meditating controls. The mechanism is not mystical. It is the physiological consequence of repeatedly activating the parasympathetic nervous system and damping down the HPA axis. The fact that the practice feels simple or even counterintuitively unsophisticated does not change what it does at the molecular level. Time in natural outdoor environments is another intervention that is supported by more rigorous data than its simplicity suggests. Consistent research shows that 20 or more minutes spent in green space, a park, a trail, a garden, produces measurable reductions in cortisol and shifts in autonomic nervous system tone from sympathetic toward parasympathetic dominance. The HPA axis evolved in an environment that included substantial time outdoors. There is legitimate evidence that the chronic absence of that context functions as a low-grade stressor in its own right. I also want to address, because patients ask me regularly, the role of sleep quality in stress management, not just as a downstream problem, but as a direct cortisol regulator. One of the most robust relationships in the HPA literature is between poor sleep and elevated morning cortisol. This is part of why sleep is the first priority. Improving sleep directly reduces cortisol, which reduces stem cell stress, which reduces the senescence cascade, which reduces the inflammatory environment, which in turn makes it easier to sleep. These systems are coupled, and the coupling works in both directions. Now I want to spend some time on a topic that the research is genuinely exciting about, which is intermittent fasting, and I want to handle it carefully because the evidence is compelling in some contexts and requires caution in others. Research from MIT's Koch Institute, led by Yilmaz and colleagues, and published in Cell Stem Cell, showed that a 24-hour fasting period doubled the regenerative capacity of intestinal stem cells in both young and aged mice. The mechanism was activation of fatty acid oxidation pathways regulated by PPAR transcription factors. Essentially, the fast forces the stem cells to switch their metabolic fuel source in a way that enhances their regenerative function. The effect was present in aged animals as well as young ones, which is the critical point for our audience. A 2024 study from Columbia University added a remarkable finding. Fasting refeeding cycles, meaning deliberate alternation between periods of caloric restriction and normal eating, appeared to activate autophagy in aged hematopoietic stem cells and substantially restore their function toward what you would measure in young animals. These are not marginal improvements. They are the kind of functional restoration that suggests significant biological plasticity remains in the aged stem cell system. However, and this is a meaningful however, research from MIT, published in Nature in 2024, identified that the refeeding phase, following a fast, may increase the rate of intestinal cell proliferation in a way that could elevate risk in individuals with pre-existing cancerous mutations in the intestinal epithelium. The context in which fasting is safe and clearly beneficial is not identical for everyone. If you have a personal or family history of colorectal cancer, if you have had intestinal polyps at any point, if you are at elevated risk for gastrointestinal malignancy, please have a specific conversation with your gastroenterologist before implementing any fasting protocol. This is not a reason to dismiss the evidence for fasting. It is a reason to be context-aware about it. For people without those contraindications, without a history of eating disorders, not on insulin or sulfonylurea class diabetes medications, and at a healthy weight, a moderate intermittent fasting approach appears consistent with the biology. The 16-8 protocol, a 16-hour overnight fast and an 8-hour eating window, practiced 3 to 4 days per week rather than every day, is the approach I have found most sustainable for patients in this age group. A practical implementation. Finish eating by 7 in the evening. Have breakfast at 11 the following morning. That is a 16-hour fast without disrupting social patterns significantly. If you want to start more conservatively, a 14-hour fast, finishing at 7 and starting at 9, is a reasonable entry point that allows your physiology to adapt before extending the window. On supplements, I want to be direct, because the market here is substantial and largely not grounded in the evidence we have been discussing. There is no oral supplement currently available that has been demonstrated in rigorous human clinical trials to specifically and safely activate adult stem cells. Products marketed with that language are not backed by the peer-reviewed literature. If you encounter a stem cell activator supplement, the claim on the label is not supported by the science I am aware of. There are, however, specific micronutrients with legitimate evidence for supporting the cellular processes we have described. Vitamin D3 is the most important of them. Deficiency is extraordinarily common in adults over 50, and vitamin D plays a direct role in immune cell differentiation and inflammatory regulation, both of which are tied to stem cell niche health. I recommend measuring your 25-hydroxyvitamin D level. A level below 30 nanograms per milliliter is deficient by most clinical definitions. The range supported by functional outcome data, not just by deficiency prevention, is roughly 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. Supplementation to achieve that range typically requires somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 IU daily, though individual variation is significant, and some people, particularly those who spend little time outdoors, need more. The only way to know where you are is to measure. Magnesium is substantially underappreciated in this context. It is a cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions, including several directly involved in DNA repair, which is the process that protects stem cells from the accumulation of genetic damage we have discussed throughout. Magnesium deficiency is common in people who consume a high proportion of ultra-processed foods, partly because industrial food processing removes much of the magnesium from raw ingredients. Magnesium citrate or magnesium glycinate in the range of 300 to 400 milligrams daily is well tolerated by most people. Note: if you take certain antibiotics, take magnesium with a 2-hour separation to avoid impairing antibiotic absorption. Omega-3 fatty acids from a high-quality fish oil, targeting 1 to 3 grams of combined EPA and DHA daily, have the most consistent human evidence for reducing the systemic inflammation markers we have identified as directly hostile to stem cell niches. If you are on anticoagulant therapy, discuss this with your physician before starting, as high-dose omega-3s have a modest anticoagulant effect. One caution on antioxidants specifically. I will not recommend high-dose isolated antioxidant supplements. Vitamin C above 2 grams daily, vitamin E above 400 international units daily. The intuition that more antioxidants neutralize more oxidative damage sounds logical, but there is growing evidence that stem cells actually require a certain level of reactive oxygen species as signaling molecules for proper function and differentiation. Flooding the system with isolated high-dose antioxidants may interfere with that signaling. Antioxidants from whole foods, berries, vegetables, green tea do not create this concern because they arrive in complex matrices with natural dose constraints. I want to address what monitoring looks like, because one of the most common questions I get from patients who are making these changes is, how do I know if this is working? The standard blood work I consider most informative for tracking the cellular aging picture we have been discussing is a complete blood count, which reflects the output quality of your hematopoietic stem cells in a practical and accessible way. If your CBC shows patterns of mild anemia, reduced platelet counts, or abnormal white cell differentials that are not fully explained by other causes, that is worth investigating as a possible stem cell signal. High-sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP, is the most widely available marker of systemic inflammation. A reading below 1.0 milligrams per liter represents a low inflammatory state. Most people who make consistent progress on sleep quality, dietary pattern, and stress management see this number fall meaningfully over a period of 3 to 6 months. Hemoglobin A1C reflects the glycemic environment your cells are living in and is worth tracking quarterly if you are making metabolic changes. A 25-hydroxyvitamin D level, because maintaining the 40 to 60 nanogram per milliliter window matters and fluctuates seasonally for most people in northern latitudes. And ferritin, which reflects iron storage and is closely tied to hematopoietic function. Iron deficiency is common in this age group, and is often missed because a frank anemia has not yet developed, even though the stem cell stress from iron insufficiency is real. Wearable technology that tracks resting heart rate and heart rate variability over time is generally useful as a proxy for recovery status and autonomic nervous system health. Resting heart rate creeping upward over weeks, despite maintained or reduced exercise load, is a signal worth paying attention to. Heart rate variability declining over time is one of the clearest wearable indicators that the cumulative load of sleep disruption, unmanaged stress, and exercise demand is pushing the system toward a state of chronic strain. You do not need to optimize these numbers obsessively, but tracking them provides a kind of biological feedback that was simply not available to previous generations, and it is worth using. What does a reasonable timeline look like? In the first 2 weeks, the most common shift people notice is subjective and subtle. A different quality of morning alertness. Not dramatically better necessarily, but different in character. A little more settled. A little less like you are fighting against the morning. If you are simultaneously reducing ultra-processed foods, expect the first 3 to 5 days to involve stronger than usual food cravings, because the flavor engineering in those products is sophisticated and deliberate. The cravings will pass. The biology on the other side of them is quieter and more stable. By the end of the first month, Blood markers that respond relatively quickly begin to move in people who have made meaningful changes in both sleep and dietary pattern. High sensitivity CRP in particular tends to be one of the earlier responders. Many people also report that exercise recovery feels meaningfully different, that the same workout leaves them less depleted the following morning. At the 2 to 3 month mark is typically when metabolic changes become visible in standard blood work. Fasting glucose and HbA1c respond on this timescale if meaningful dietary changes have been made. Body composition changes become visible to external measures. Muscle mass responds slowly but measurably to consistent resistance training, even in people who had come to believe that muscle loss in their 60s was simply inevitable. The changes that reflect actual stem cell biology, rather than downstream symptoms, take longer to measure, and most of us do not have access to the specialized assays used in research settings. What you are likely to notice over the 1 to 2 year range of consistent implementation, if you implement it consistently, is a pattern rather than a single dramatic improvement. Fewer and shorter illness episodes because the immune output of healthier hematopoietic stem cells is more responsive and more precise. Better recovery from physical effort because muscle satellite cells are more functional. Wounds that heal more cleanly. A quality of physical resilience that does not show up as peak performance, but as a baseline that simply does not keep declining the way it was declining before. The research that I find most intellectually striking in everything I reviewed for this conversation is not about damage, it is about the capacity for restoration. The Columbia 2024 work showing that fasting refeeding cycles could almost normalize the function of aged hematopoietic stem cells toward what you see in young animals is significant not as a practical prescription, but as a proof of principle. The aging stem cell system retains far more plasticity than the field understood even 5 years ago. Your stem cells are not passively counting down to a fixed endpoint. They are responding to signals from their environment, right now, and the environment you create through daily choices is a genuinely powerful variable. There are some things I want to be honest about, in the spirit of not overstating the certainty of the evidence. Many of the studies we discussed today, the MIT fasting work, the Columbia Stem Cell Restoration findings, the Cell Stem Cell Exercise Atlas, used animal models. The translation to human biology is supported by mechanistic plausibility and by human epidemiological data showing consistent patterns, but the rigorous controlled trials in human subjects that would let us state specific quantitative predictions with certainty have not all been done. When I tell you that Zone 2 exercise protects stem cells, I am extrapolating from an extraordinarily detailed biological atlas that used animal models, informed by human exercise physiology data and population-level associations. The evidence is coherent and substantial. It is not identical to having a 30-year randomized controlled trial in humans that measured stem cell counts as a primary endpoint. What this means practically is that the interventions I have described are consistent with the best available evidence and have excellent general health rationales independent of their stem cell effects. Better sleep, reduced ultra-processed food consumption, appropriate exercise, managed chronic stress, these would be beneficial recommendations regardless of the stem cell data. The stem cell research adds a mechanistic understanding of why they matter so specifically in this age group and with this degree of urgency. It does not require you to suspend judgment or accept speculative claims. The foundation is solid. I also want to be honest that there is individual variation in all of this. The same dietary change that meaningfully reduces hsCRP in one person may produce a smaller effect in another, depending on genetics, microbiome composition, metabolic history, and dozens of other variables that population-level studies smooth over. The target is not to perfectly replicate a research protocol. The target is directional. Move consistently away from the habits that the evidence identifies as harmful and move consistently toward the ones identified as protective. And then use your own measurable biomarkers and your own subjective experience of energy, recovery, and resilience to calibrate over time. There is one more thing I want to say before we close. People in their 50s and 60s have grown up in a medical culture that largely treated aging as something to manage and slow at best, but not meaningfully reverse. The framing was fundamentally passive. These things decline. We try to minimize the rate of decline. We accept the rest. What the emerging science of stem cell biology is beginning to offer is a fundamentally different frame. The declines we associate with aging in immune function, muscle maintenance, tissue repair, and metabolic resilience are substantially, though not entirely, driven by the condition of a cell population that is responsive to its environment. Change the environment, and the population responds. That is not a promise of immortality or a cure for aging. The biology is more complex and more humbling than that, but it is a meaningful shift in agency. The habits we have discussed today are not marginal lifestyle optimizations. At the cellular level, they are signals that either support or undermine the system your body most depends on for the repairs and adaptations that determine how well and how independently you age. I spent years sending the wrong signals because I did not know what I know now, and because the information was not easy to find or clearly communicated. That is the reason I do this, and it is why these conversations matter to me. If you found this useful, the video on mitochondrial function and aging in the description links directly to the mechanisms we covered today and goes deeper on the energy production side of cellular aging. I think you will find that it adds a significant layer to what we discussed here. Leave a comment with what surprised you most, or the habit you are going to address first. Those comments genuinely shape what I research next. I read everyone. Keep investigating. Keep asking hard questions of the information you receive, including from me. I will see you in the next one.